Welcome to lesson number 8, PCI-DSS version 4, requirement 1. I mentioned in one of our previous videos that I was going to cover at a high level version 3.1, but after hearing some feedback from students and also colleagues, I decided not to. Instead, I want to spend more time with you covering all of the different requirements and sub-requirements of version 4, which at the end, it is the main intent of this course. So with that being said, let's begin. A quick note here before starting. I would like to review with you the implementation timeline. PCI-DSS version 4 was officially released on Q1 of 2022. Now in 2023, we can still work with either version 3.1 or version 4, but starting March 2024, we are going to get PCI-DSS version 3.1 retired, and we will be working only with PCI-DSS version 4. Some of the new requirements that as of right now are listed as recommendations, future data requirements will become effective starting March 2025. And here we are. Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard version 4 released on March 2022. We will be covering today requirement 1, looking at the main requirements, the sub-requirements, and the testing procedures. And here we are. Requirement 1. Install and maintain network security controls. Now this requirement, it is divided in main sub-requirements. 1.1. Processes and mechanisms for installing and maintaining network security controls are defined and understood. 1.2. Network security controls and NSC are configured and maintained. 1.3. Network access to and from the cardholder data environment, CDE, is restricted. 1.4. Network connections between trusted and untrusted networks are controlled. 1.5. Risk to the CDE from computing devices that are capable to connect to both untrusted networks and the CDE are mitigated. In this standard, you are going to find a lot of different terms that are new. You didn't see those in version 3.1 or any other of the previous versions. So I recommend you to go to the Appendix G of the new version and familiarize yourself with all of those new terms. So let's begin with requirement 1.1. Processes and mechanisms for installing and maintaining network security controls are defined and understood. 1.1.1. All security policies and operational procedures that are identified in requirement 1 are documented, kept up to date, in use, and known to all affected parties. If you are completely new with the PCI-DSS, I'm going to clarify first for you. In the left section, we have the requirement. In the section in the middle, we have the testing procedures, basically how it is going the QSA to test this particular requirement, or the ISA, or you, if you are an internal resource, helping your organization getting prepared for the first time PCI certification. And at the right side, we have some guidance from the PCI Council. In this case, we have what is the purpose of the requirement, some good practices, and definitions. Something additional here too is that we have the defined approach and the customized approach. For the purposes of this video and the next following 11 videos from requirement 1 till 12, we are going to be covering the defined approach, which is the same approach that we use for all of the previous versions of the DSS. And in another video, I am going to explain to you what the customized approach is, how to work with it, and who can implement it. There is a lot. This customized approach is new, and we will cover it in a separate video. So back to the requirement 1.1.1, all of the different policies and procedures that are identified in requirement 1 are documented, kept up to date, in use, and known to all affected parties. Very simple, pretty straightforward. How can we test this requirement? We are going to review documentation and interview personnel. Most of the companies require all of the employees to read and sign, acknowledging that they review the policies at least once a year. And if it's a new employee, in the onboarding process, those new employees need to review, to read the policies, get familiar with the policies, especially policies regarding cardholder data or account data. There is a lot that new employees need to get familiar with. So that's an easy way to meet this requirement. First, having the policy in place, the procedure in place, or any other document related to this requirement. And also making sure that it is reviewing this documentation on the onboarding process in the case of the policies, and at least once a year for more specific documentation like procedures, for example. Requirement 1.1.2. Roles and responsibilities for performing activities in requirement 1 are documented, assigned, and understood. This is a new requirement, effective immediately. And the testing procedure is simple. We are going to review documentation to verify that descriptions of roles and responsibilities for performing activities in requirement 1 are documented and assigned. Also, make sure you understand what your responsibilities are in regards to your role. If you are the one that interacts with the city, the network engineer. If you are the network engineer and you are interacting directly with cardholder data or account data, you need to know what your responsibilities are in regards to that interaction, or how you process or somehow work directly with account data. And in general, you need to understand that whatever it is written in paper saying the network engineer is responsible for doing this and that is actually what you understand that you need to do. Requirement 1.2. Network security controls are configured and maintained. Remember, we discussed what network security controls are in one of our previous videos. If you're not sure what that means, go to the Appendix G and find that in the definitions. Sub-requirement 1.2.1. Configuration standards for network security controls rule sets are defined, implemented, and maintained. So for example here, we need to have configuration standards for routers, switches, firewalls. Make sure that those are defined, implemented, maintained, properly documented. Something with PCI is that we want to have documentation of pretty much everything. So make sure you have things properly documented and follow each one of the bullets of this requirement. It is defined, what it is acceptable, what is not, is implemented, what it is in paper is actually what you are implementing, and maintain. There is someone looking at those rule sets. There is someone making sure that it is not changing, or someone without the right access, it is changing those rules without anyone else knowing about it. Requirement 1.2.2. All changes to network connections and to configurations of network security controls are approved and managed in accordance with the change control process defined in requirement 651. This is simple. Basically, if you are going to change, for example, configurations of the firewall, that change before you doing anything, you need to get approval, either senior management or someone at a senior level. It has to approve that change. How? We need to have a change control process in place, and we will see what that means in requirement 651. But basically, at a high level, before you're doing anything, it has to be, you need to request that change in written. Someone needs to review that change, how it would impact the security of the environment. Is there any type of rollback process in case that the change can cause a vulnerability? For example, can you go back to the same, or better, the same state that it was in the past? and so on. Basically, everything has to be documented and properly approved. How are we going to test this requirement, the testing procedure? Review of documentation. If any type of changes in those network security controls took place, for example, in the last year, as the QSA, I'm going to ask you, can you please provide me with a list of changes for network security controls, in this case, let's say firewall, in the last 12 months. So I take one of those changes and then I go to the formal change control process and I identify that change. If that change was not documented, it was not approved, that's a fail. Requirement 1.3. An accurate network diagram is maintained that shows all connections between the CDE and other networks, including any wireless networks. This is pretty straightforward. Make sure that your diagram, it is being reviewed at least once a year, I would say every 6 months at least. And every time that someone it is reviewing that diagram, make sure that it is stating or marking somewhere in the diagram the day that it was reviewed and the name of that person. How are we going to test this requirement? The testing procedure, very easy, just looking at the diagram, making sure that it was reviewed at least in the last 6 months, 12 months. And also making sure that interviewing personnel, it is an accurate representation. We can determine this is an accurate representation of the environment. Requirement 1.2.4. An accurate data flow diagram is maintained that meets the following. 1. Shows all account data flows across systems and networks, and 2. Updated as needed upon changes to the environment. Basically same as the previous requirement. We need to have this diagram updated. Every time that you update this diagram, make sure you are putting the date and the name of the person updating the diagram. If there are any type of significant changes to the environment, you need to also review this diagram after that change and most likely all of the applicable requirements. How are we going to test it? Well, pretty simple. We are going to examine that data flow diagram and interview personnel to verify that diagrams show all account data flows in accordance with all of the elements specified in this requirement. Basically, make sure you have that data flow diagram, it is updated and it is showing all of the different flows of account data going to and coming from. And remember that when we say account data, we are talking about cardholder data and sensitive authentication data. Requirement 1.2.5. All services, protocols, and ports allowed are identified, approved, and have a defined business need. Testing procedure, we are going to examine documentation to verify that a list exists, meaning you need to have a documented list of all of the different ports, protocols, and services that you need for your normal operations. But more than just having the list, you need to have a business justification or define what is the purpose for having that service, protocol, or port allowed into the environment. Now, once we have the list of all of the approved service, protocols, and ports, we are going to examine the configuration settings for network security controls like firewalls, routers, and switches. And if we identify let's say one protocol, one service, one port that is not listed in that list that we receive from the entity saying this is the list of all of the approved ones, that's a fail, meaning you are enabling a service, protocol, or port that is not listed in your list of approved services, protocols, and ports. Basically, everything that is approved has to be documented. If you are allowing something that it is not documented, first of all, you're not going to have a justification for it because most likely you don't even know that it is being enabled. So make sure you review that on a regular basis and everything it is documented. Requirement 126. Security features are defined and implemented for all services, protocols, and ports that are in use and considered to be insecure, such that risk is mitigated. Basically, if you are going to be allowing an insecure service, protocol, or port because you have to, for let's say compatibility issues, you need to have some type of compensating control, something that at least it is going to mitigate that risk. Because at the time you allowing, for example, let's say TLS 1.0 or 1.1, that's a vulnerability for your environment. And if you have to do it because one of your systems is not compatible with any other of the newer versions of TLS, you need to create some type of compensating control and make sure that it is mitigating the risk. How are we going to test this requirement? We are going to examine documentation that identifies all insecure services, protocols, and ports in use to verify that for each one, security features are defined to mitigate the risk. Here we see the phrase security features. What does it mean? Well, it is that I would say that's open to interpretation. As long as you have some type of mitigating control, which is the intent of the requirement, I would say that's good. Also, make sure that whatever insecure service, port, or protocol you are allowing into your environment, it is for business purposes, meaning that that's the only way for you to run business. You have to. It's strictly necessary. Other than that, do not enable insecure services or protocols. And if that's the case, most likely this requirement is not going to be applicable for entities that are not allowing any type of insecure services, ports, or protocols. Requirement 127, 1.2.7. Configurations of network security controls are reviewed at least once every 6 months to confirm they are relevant and effective. I was mentioning previously that for firewalls, routers, switches, make sure that those configurations are reviewed at least once every 12 years. Well, here we get more clarification. It's actually once every 6 months. So make sure that you are reviewing those and that you are documenting those reviews, because that's the evidence that we're going to have in order to prove that we are implementing this process as per this requirement. Testing procedures for this requirement, documentation, more documentation. We are going to examine documentation to verify procedures are defined for reviewing configuration of network security controls at least once every 6 months. Meaning this process, it has to be documented somewhere that it says, for example, network engineer A, B, or C, it needs to review the network security controls configurations at least once every 4 months, 5 months. I mean, maximum, as per this requirement, it is 6 months. I would say do it at least every 4 to 5. Never go too close to 6 months, because people can forget. We get, I don't know, someone got sick, or things happen, right? So don't wait till the last minute. Do it before if you can. Requirement 1.2.8. Configuration files for network security controls are secured from unauthorized access, kept consistent with active network configurations. For example, we have an example here. If the secure configuration for a router is stored in a non-volatile memory, when that router is restarted or rebooted, these controls should ensure that its secure configuration is reinstated. How are we going to test this requirement? We are going to examine those configuration files for network security controls to verify that they are in accordance with all elements specified in this requirement. Requirement 1.3. Network access to and from the CDE is restricted. 1.3.1. Inbound traffic to the CDE is restricted as follows. First, to only traffic that is necessary, And second, all other traffic is specifically denied. How are we going to test this requirement? We're going to examine configuration standards for network security controls to verify that they define restricting inbound traffic to the CDE in accordance with all of the elements specified in this requirement. An example, we have here an example for this requirement, could be implementing a rule that denies all inbound and outbound traffic that is not specifically needed, for example, by using an explicit deny all at the end of the rules, or implicit deny after allow statement that would help to prevent inadvertent holds that would allow an unintended and potentially harmful traffic into these configurations. So basically, make sure that you are only allowing what you need for business purposes. Requirement 1.3.2. Outbound traffic from the CDE is restricted as follows. First, to only traffic that is necessary, and second, all other traffic is specifically denied. Basically the same that 1.3.1. Requirement 1.3.3. Network security controls are installed between all wireless networks and the CDE, regardless of whether the wireless network is a CDE, such that first, all wireless traffic from wireless networks into the CDE is denied by default, and second, only wireless traffic with an authorized business purpose is allowed into the CDE. How are we going to test this requirement? We are going to examine configuration settings and network diagrams to verify that network security controls, like a firewall in this case, are implemented between all wireless networks and the CDE in accordance with all of the elements specified in this requirement. Something that I want to mention here, and the way that I want you to think about this requirement, is any type of connection from a wireless device, it is considered insecure. No matter what type of encryption it is that device is using, is still considered insecure, and that's I'm assuming that's why the PCI Council considered this to be necessary to have an additional firewall in front of any type of wireless traffic. So wireless connections always going to be denied by default, and any type of wireless going connections or traffic going to the CDE, it has to be specifically approved for business purposes. Make sure that your firewalls are always in the middle of the CDE and any type of wireless connections or wireless device. Requirement 1.4. Network connections between trusted and untrusted networks are controlled. And again, as I mentioned before, wireless connections, wireless devices, that's considered an untrusted network. Anything wireless is untrusted. It is not written here. I don't think so, but I just want you to know that wireless is untrusted. Requirement 1.4.1. Network security controls such as routers, switches, firewalls are implemented between trusted and untrusted networks. A clear definition here of an untrusted network, the internet. So you need to have some type of firewall in front of or segregating that connection, separating your CDE from the rest of the world, right? You don't want to have your corporate network connecting directly to the CDE because those different network zones have different security features. And we are not going to treat the CDE the same way that we treat our corporate network. So, and you might think your corporate network, it is a trusted network. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not. Your CDE, it should be a trusted network. You should have all of the security controls implemented in your CDE. How are we going to test this requirement? 1.4.1. We are going to examine configuration standards, again, those configuration standards for firewalls, routers, switchers, and network diagrams to verify that network security controls are defined between trusted and untrusted networks. For example, between your corporate network and the CDE, or between a DMZ and the CDE, or between a wireless network and the CDE. Requirement 1.4.2. Inbound traffic from untrusted networks to trusted networks is restricted to: first, communications with system components that are authorized to provide publicly accessible services, protocols, and ports, a web server, for example. Second, stateful responses to communications initiated by system components in a trusted network. And third, all other traffic is denied. If it's not specifically authorized, it has to be denied. I want to look at the applicability notes of this requirement, and the intent of this requirement is to address communication sessions between trusted and untrusted networks, rather than the specifics of protocols. How are we going to test this requirement? Testing procedures. We are going to examine vendor documentation and configurations of network security controls to verify that inbound traffic from untrusted networks to trusted networks is restricted in accordance with all elements specified in this requirement. And if you look at all of the different testing procedures for most of the requirements that we have reviewed, documentation is crucial. And I want to emphasize that one more time. We need to have most of the things, if not all of the things we do, properly documented. Requirement 1.4.3. Anti-spoofing measures are implemented to detect and block forged source IP addresses from entering the trusted network. This is pretty straightforward. I would say it's a simple requirement. Most of the products usually come with anti-spoofing mechanisms already set as a default. And just in case you need to consult your vendor, that's actually recommended here as a good practice. You should consult with the vendors and make sure that those anti-spoofing mechanisms are included in whatever solution you are using for your IDS IPS solutions or for your firewalls. If you are using a UTM, Unified Threat Mechanism solutions, most likely you are going to find those included there. Requirement 1.4.4. System components that store cardholder data are not directly accessible from untrusted networks. I'm going to read that one more time. System components that store cardholder data are not directly accessible from untrusted networks. If you are following the approach of requirement 1, you can realize that we started by covering the configuration standards for network security controls, then our firewalls, then how are we going to segment the network. This is kind of emphasizing that, making sure that at no point you are going to allow any type of connection coming from or going to the CDE without first going through some type of system like a firewall, for example, but is not going to take place directly without some type of interaction or going through a firewall in this case. Testing procedures for this requirement. We are going to examine the data flow diagram and network diagram. Why would you think we are going to review those two? Because there we are going to have the topology of the network, and we are going to make sure that we have a firewall, for example, in front of the CDE, and there is no way that we are being able to communicate directly, for example, from the corporate network directly to the CDE, or from a wireless network to the CDE, or directly from the internet to the CDE without going through the firewall. In this particular case, we also are going to examine configurations of those network security controls. I want to emphasize firewalls in this case because it's the most usual, not the only one. And we want to verify that controls are implemented in such a way that system components storing cardholder data are not directly accessible from untrusted networks. Requirement 1.4.5, the disclosure of internal IP addresses and routing information is limited to only authorized parties. If you don't need to, you shouldn't have this type of information. Pretty simple. How are we going to test it? We're going to examine configurations of network security controls to verify that the disclosure of internal IP addresses and routing information is limited to only those who really need to have access to this type of information. We are also going to interview personnel and make sure this is actually taking place. An example that we have here for this particular requirement is some type of methodology for obscuring IP addresses. For example, network address translation, NAT, or placing system components behind a proxy server. Requirement 1.5. Risks to the CDE from computing devices that are able to connect to both untrusted networks and the CDE are mitigated. Requirement 1.5.1. Security controls are implemented on any computing devices, including company and employee-owned devices that connect to both untrusted networks, including the internet, and the CDE as follows. First, specific configuration settings are defined to prevent threats being introduced into the entity's network. Second, security controls are actively running. And third, security controls are not alterable by users or the computing devices unless specifically documented and authorized by management on a case-by-case basis for a limited period of time. This particular requirement is, I would say, if you're thinking, when we mention here employee-owned devices, you might be thinking of those bring your own device policies. And depending on how robust that policy is, this might be a difficult requirement to achieve or to be compliant with. Because if it's company-owned devices, easy, you follow the configuration standards, that's it. But employee-owned devices, that's hard to tell. I mean, it's your phone, it's your laptop, it's your tablet. You might follow some basic rules, but who knows? In your house, maybe your kids are using your phone or using your tablet or your laptop or whatever the case might be. So it's hard to control. I would say pay close attention to what your company policies are. How are we going to test this requirement? Well, we're going to review those policies and configuration standards and also interview personnel to verify that security controls for computing devices that connect to untrusted networks and the CDE are implemented in accordance with this requirement. Something easy that I want you to think of is, for example, if you are bringing your own device and that device is also connecting to the CDE, you need to have some type of personal firewall installed in your device, in your laptop, for example. If you're using Windows, there is a Windows solution already included there. But also think about some endpoint protection solution or something around that. And that, my friends, was requirement 1 of the PCI-DSS version 4. See you in requirement 2.